But thank you for joining us for Exploring Art Colonies in New England. We're going to explore 8 late 19th and early 20th century summer art colonies across New England. They will include Provincetown and Cape Ann in Massachusetts, North Conway and Cornish in New Hampshire, Old Lyme and Cos Cob in Connecticut, and Ogunquit and Monhegan Island in Maine. Hopefully I got most of that right.
Good job,
during
Rob.
the summer month, I did. Thanks, Martha. During the summer months, you'll be able to visit the sites and museums we'll discuss that reflect the incredible creative energy that still exists in these art colonies in New England. And this talk is led by Martha Chiarchiaro, who's the owner of Seeing History, who has brought history to life through the art of the times for more than 30 years. Martha received her master's in the history of art from Williams College, and she provides a variety of art history presentations at the Worcester Art Museum, the Worcester Institute for Senior Education, and of course, libraries, senior centers, and a variety of garden clubs. I again want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library and the Corning Foundation here in Tewksbury for co-sponsoring today's event. So all 125 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Martha for joining us this morning. And Martha, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you so much for your sponsors. It's just wonderful to have the opportunity to share this topic that is certainly one that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. As Robert mentioned, I'm going to be looking at several different art colonies of New England. I'm actually doing a 5-part course for the Worcester Institute for Senior Education starting next week for the month of June on this topic. And it started to occur to me as Robert was asking for different topics, that it would be fun to condense this to an hour program so that you can begin thinking about some of these places as part of your summer adventures. We're so fortunate, and certainly for those of you who are not in New England, although there are several people in New Hampshire and Maine, that's wonderful. Perhaps you'll have an opportunity this summer or fall to come up to New England to enjoy these beautiful, beautiful spaces. And also, too, as part of the, if you want to put in the chat, if you've been to any of these places and you'd like to recommend a hotel or a place to eat or something that you did while you were there, it would be great to share this. So think about this as enhancing your summer adventure experiences. And as Robert had mentioned, we're going to be looking at New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine as we explore these areas. Now, I won't be able to include all of the artists who went to these places. I'm going to be showing you kind of the highlights of these individuals. And perhaps you weren't aware that Edward Hopper was up in Monhegan Island, or the number of artists who were in the Gloucester area. Now, I won't be able to go through all of them, but I wanted to do some highlights of these artists who are there. And if there are museums, I'm going to be pointing out museums for you also. So let's begin. And I'll be more than happy to answer any questions or share observations at the end of the program. So the first one that I'm going to be sharing with you is North Conway, New Hampshire. If any of you have been either skiing up in Bretton Woods or near Mount Washington, Tucker Ravine, you probably are aware of the incredible, incredible landscape up in the North Conway area, Conway, North Conway. And certainly you can see that it is a bit of a ride, but not far from even Portland, Manchester, Boston, probably about maybe a 2.5 hour drive, but well worth the drive, both in the summertime as well as for winter activities. And you might wonder why I'm starting with North Conway, because it truly was one of the first, and you might say, colonies. The Mount Washington area, the North Conway area, was one of the first areas that artists like Thomas Cole, considered the father of the Hudson River School. Now, it's important to note that the Hudson, oh, let me just make sure my battery's on. The Hudson River School was actually a somewhat derogatory term that was given to this group of painters that we'll be looking at much later in the 1890s, 1870s, much later than when they were working. But because they thought of it as a school, it really wasn't, but it was a group of individuals, of artists coming together and painting the glorious landscapes of our New England area in New Hampshire. And this is just one of several. Thomas Cole, looking at, again, an autumn twilight in Conway Peak in New Hampshire, done in 1834. So this is definitely one of the earliest times when artists travel together to a gorgeous site to paint together, to share this. And you can imagine what New York City looked like around 1825, 1830s. It was really a lot of squalor, congestion. People were thrilled when the train connected New York with Albany, connected with various places in New England. It really made a wonderful opportunity. The view of Mountain Pass, called the Notch of the White Mountains, was also a gorgeous image. So we have the opportunity to see many of these same views today. John Frederick Kensett was also an artist working in this particular area. You can see a very different style, perhaps a more subtle style in the works. Mount Washington from the Valley of Conway. This is one in the Wellesley College Museum of Art in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And also a piece from the Worcester Art Museum, North Conway Valley in New Hampshire. So we can think about the Conway area, North Conway in New Hampshire, as one of the first areas where artists left New York. And you will find fairly consistently in this presentation, many of these artists were in New York and they wanted a summer retreat. They wanted to go someplace to get out of the city. And although it wasn't technically a school, and really they probably wouldn't even have considered themselves a colony. We'll talk a little bit more about the definition of a colony, an art colony, and how it changes from one location to the other. But it certainly is the first location that we find artists coming together to enjoy the views, enjoy the camaraderie, and share these images with their public and their patrons in the Boston area, but particularly in the New York area. We also have Jasper Cropsey. Jasper Cropsey was, in fact, one of the earliest artists to be focusing his attention solely on landscape. This really was, with Thomas Cole, with Kensett, with Cropsey, this period of art is considered one of the first truly American periods of art. Many of the portraits that would have been done earlier would have had European influence. Certainly many of the works later in the century with the Impressionists and the Barbizon School. But you can think about from 1825 to about 1875, a truly American style. And it's not surprising that it was the American landscape in New England that provided such a wonderful source. So these are just a few examples of some of the very early artists who were coming around 1825 into the 1850s. Now, that's not to say that other artists wouldn't have come later. And here we have Winslow Homer, certainly a wonderful favorite. And I'm using his painting, a detail of his painting as my virtual background. This is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek painting that he did. Artist sketching in the White Mountains, dating from 1868. We will see in this presentation that many other locations became truly art colonies. So when we think of North Conway, gorgeous area, lots of artists very early on in the American repertoire of landscape painting went there, but they didn't necessarily come in a formal way as other colonies that we'll see have done, where they're literally the teachers of students in New York moved to many of these New England colonies in the summer and taught many of the same students. North Conway was different, but it was the first area in New England that artists came to. And certainly Winslow Homer loved the area, and he's kind of showing you all these men out there painting Mount Washington. This is a work in the Portland Museum of Art. When we look at Maine, certainly the Portland Museum of Art is another bonus, that if you're up in the Maine area, either at Ogunquit or Monhegan Island, a stop at the Portland Museum of Art is certainly well worth the visit. But we also know that Winslow Homer was inspired by the White Mountains, by the area in Conway and North Conway. We have his Bridle Path at the Clark Art Institute, and we also have his Mount Washington, also 1869. We'll talk a little bit more about Homer when we look at some of the other colonies. And that's one of the things I wanted to comment on. You probably will notice that artists are going from one area to the other. Some stayed very locally in the art colony that they enjoyed for the summer. When we look at Cornish in just a moment, you'll see that. But many of these artists loved the openness, loved the New England environment, and they might travel to various areas in the summer. And we'll have a chance to see that. So now we've looked at North Conway, and I wanted to start there because it really is the first opportunity that artists, because landscape painting only really began in America around 1825 with Thomas Cole. And that was the first area in the North Conway area that people went to. But I wanted to share with you now Cornish as an art colony, because it also was very different from those that we'll be seeing in Massachusetts, even in Maine and in Connecticut. So Cornish, New Hampshire, again, not a far drive. You can see where Nashua is. It's about a 2-hour drive. If you want to take a trip to the Dartmouth Hanover Museum, the Hood Museum up in that area, it's very close to this area of Cornish. You can see the gorgeous landscape with a Ascutney Mountain in the distance. And it was in the 1880s that Charles Cutworth Beeman Jr., a New York lawyer, bought hundreds of acres around Cornish. And Cornish, you can see, is right on the Vermont line. Sometimes they'll even mention that they're in Vermont. Sometimes they'll note that they're in New Hampshire. It's right on, this is the Vermont, New Hampshire line. So it was an individual, a wealthy individual, who bought a lot of land in this area with the goal of encouraging writers and artists, playwrights, poets, everyone to kind of come to this idyllic area for the summer. And it was at that point a 9-hour train ride from New York City. So many people would literally plan 3 months in the Cornish area. But they were different from some of the other colonies that we'll be looking at. They did not center its activity on a summer art school, as we'll particularly see in Cos Cob and Old Lyme. They never established a formal art association, which would have happened in Ogunquit, even Monhegan, and they didn't present formal annual exhibitions. Think of the Cornish group as an opportunity for artists in a variety of different medium coming together to be able to share the beauty and the enrichment of this area. Now, one of the key areas, one of the key draws to this area is the work of Augustus St. Gaudens. He arrived, so again, in the early 1880s, the lawyer bought the land. And Augustus St. Gaudens was the first individual to arrive there for the summer in 1885. He's a major sculptor in the latter part of the 19th century. And he built this home, and this incredible tree was planted when Augustus St. Gaudens arrived around 1885. He built this home. This is one of the verandas. You can see the lower right, Mount Ascutney in the background. This area is now, thanks to his wife, Augusta St. Gaudens. When St. Gaudens died in 1907, he moved there permanently when he was moved to Cornish permanently when he was diagnosed with cancer. He lived another 7 years, and it's with the effort of his son Homer and particularly his wife. And they've created this incredible memorial. It's now a national park, and it's only one of 2 national parks run by the Rangers, 2 national parks dedicated to artists, and we'll happen to see both of them in this presentation. So this is a beautiful, beautiful space. You can take a lunch, you can enjoy the grounds. There are rivers and streams in the area, but you can also see replicas of the majority of works that Augustus St. Gaudens did in the latter part of the 19th century and some of the early 20th century. So an example of his Puritan dating from 1887 that was in New York, a beautiful, very emotional monument, a grave monument called the Adams Memorial, sculpted in 1891. So I'm just showing you a few pieces. Even his Abraham Lincoln, the sitting, here again, the sitting Lincoln Monument, again, standing Lincoln Monument. There were various images. The one on the right is just a bust of Lincoln, but at the Augustus Memorial Park, you'll find all of these different pieces that his wife brought in, spent a great deal of money. Several pieces were donated, both his relief work as well as his 3-dimensional work. It is a wonderful, wonderful place to visit, particularly in the spring, summer, or fall. It's a lovely area, and you can see he was an artist who then brought other artists. He had his studio in the summer, and you'll see that studio. He had a studio in the summer, and in fact, it was believed that one of the local farmers was used as the model for his figure of Abraham Lincoln. That was one of the draws that his friend Beeman had said, who had bought the land, said, hey, come on up to Cornish. You're going to find lots of strapping men who can serve as the example for many of your sculptures. So well worth the visit, very educational, but it shows you kind of the sense of an artist coming to an area for a number of years, for 14 years, every summer, and then eventually settling there in a beautiful environment. But he was not the only artist. Thomas Wilmer Dewing, who is one of the American Impressionists, also spent time. He arrived there in 1886, around the same time, just about a year later, after Augustus St. Gaudens. These are some of his toneless pieces that show you the mountains in the area. He only stayed, though, until around 1905. He believed that it was becoming too socially minded. I'm not really sure what that means, but so he was going to a variety of places, but he spent most of his summers there for, again, a number of years, almost 20 years. And these are paintings that are inspired by the environment. We know that Kenyon Cox, these are all artists who were working in New York in particular, but they spent their summers in the Cornish area. And this is a beautiful piece. It's by Kenyon Cox, the upper left-hand side of Augustus St. Gaudens working in his studio in Cornish. Unfortunately, there was a fire in the studio, and he created a replica the year following Augustus St. Gaudens' death. He died in 1907, and he did a replica of this in 1908. So you can see that, again, he settled permanently in the Cornish area. But remember, there were not a formal art association. It was simply individuals, but playwrights, poets, a number of different individuals who came to this area. They would have masks, they would have balls, they would write plays together, they would act together. It's like summer stock in the Cornish area. But they were more informal in the way that they presented the environment of Cornish. Certainly, Augustus St. Gaudens would bring up a number of assistants who would come with him to work on the pieces during the summer. And that was somewhat of an informal studio, but others just really were there for the wonderful intellectual stimulation. We know that Willard Metcalf loved the Cornish hills. He also, too, was one of the American Impressionists working primarily in the New York area, but he created 36 landscapes of the area and eventually moved to Cornish in 1909. And I wanted to show you these because not only was he there in the summer, as indicated from the lower right-hand corner slide, he was also there in the winter time. So several of these artists stayed there in the winter. But another artist who's very well known in the area, Maxfield Parrish. And do note how different all of these artists were? That's one of the things that when we look at some of the other colonies, there is a consistency amongst their styles, particularly when you're looking at the American Impressionist style. But each of these artists were very different. We know Maxfield Parrish creating these wonderfully fantastic images. He was an illustrator early on in his career. He ended up arriving here in 1898. He suffered shortly after from TB. He discovered how to mix oils and glazes to make these vibrant colors. He's certainly well known for this almost glistening, glowing colors. And his illustrations were the primary focus of his early career. His daughter is, in fact, one of the individuals on the right-hand side, the lower right-hand side. That's his youngest daughter who modeled for this figure of ecstasy. But he actually did settle in the Cornish area. And you can see here, again, a work dating from around 1932. He continued to create works and eventually focused primarily on landscape painting. You can see these luscious colors of the New Hampshire hills that he created as he was there. So Cornish, a beautiful area that you can go to visit, the Augustus St. Gaudens Memorial. There aren't, the home that Maxfield Parrish built there is actually up for sale, but it's not a private collection. It's not a museum, but it's certainly well worth the visit to Augustus St. Gaudens. And they even have a map of some of the locations for where other of the Cornish colonies were. So that gives us a sense of New Hampshire and how important, but very different. Conway, again, one of the first areas in 1825, where New York artists traveled to look at the wonderful landscape. And then Cornish, also an area where a number of artists settled, so certainly considered a colony, but different from the ones that we're going to be looking at now. They didn't necessarily have exhibitions. They didn't have an association. They didn't have a formal summer training, but they had creative energy amongst artists and writers in this gorgeous area. So now let's look at Provincetown, the Provincetown Art Colony. And I'm only going to be able to point out just a few of the artists who were here, but a delightful visit. Now, I was there probably about maybe 6 weeks ago, and it was wonderful. There was no traffic. I have a feeling this is the kind of place you want to do in the spring and in the fall, because in the summertime, I think Provincetown, as you can imagine on the Cape, is going to be very busy. But Provincetown Art Colony is considered America's oldest continuous art colony. Others might have started a little earlier, but they're really not as focused on an art colony. Provincetown still has a number of galleries, opportunities for painters. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. And so we know in 1914, the Provincetown Art Association was formed. We know in 1916, there was an article in the Globe, the Boston Globe, that said Provincetown was the biggest art colony in the world. And so it really was an area that attracted a number of individuals, a gorgeous landscape, very different from some of the others. And you'll see that. You'll see often why artists were in a variety of different areas, but Provincetown is well worth a visit. And interestingly enough, some names that you might not be familiar with. Charles Hawthorne was one of the first artists to create his a teaching museum, an opportunity to teach. He was teaching again in the latter part of the 19th century. He was providing an opportunity for individuals again to come in the summer, and it was incredibly busy. I think there sometimes were over 300 artists who would travel to Provincetown. Not a bad place to be in the summer, particularly if you're in Boston or New York, where it would be incredibly hot. Even in the late 19th century, not necessarily the prettiest places to be. But you can see he was a figure painter. But he was also an artist who was painting out of doors. And that's one of the things that many of these artists brought to their summer studies, painting en plein air, out of doors. Certainly something that was happening in Europe with the Barbizon School around 1850. That certainly couldn't have happened unless the American John Rand had created in 1841 the first collapsible tin tube of paint. So it allowed in this latter century for artists to be painting out of doors. And what a better environment than many of these landscapes in New England. We also see E. Ambrose Webster, not perhaps a name that you're familiar with, but another individual who created these wonderful opportunities and was, in fact, creating, he was a teacher, again, creating these opportunities for people to study. You can see how his style changed in just 10 years. The drying nets in Provincetown, kind of those deeper colors, 1903. And then here's Summer Garden in 1913, the strong influence of perhaps the American Impressionists. And this is in the collection of the town of Provincetown, so you can see it locally. So these are artists who settled in Provincetown, who set up schools, and who were very strongly influenced, particularly with en plein air painting. Now, what's interesting, what you might not be aware of, is that in the area of Provincetown, there were other modern artists, truly modern artists. Hans Hofmann, who was a German American, he came over between the wars, World War I and World War II, and from the mid 30s to the late 50s, Hans Hofmann divided his time between teaching in New York City and Provincetown. So that was a very, very strong influence. Now, not in Provincetown, but the Cape Cod Museum of Art has some wonderful, they have videos of Hans Hofmann. They have many of the works of art that you're seeing here. So if you have a chance, that's right on 6A. In Dennis. It's a lovely museum if you have the opportunity, perhaps if you're on your way to Provincetown, to be able to see some of the pieces. And in fact, you can see this walk on the right-hand side. This is very different from what we've seen in these earlier kind of realistic painters, but this was an anonymous gift given to the Cape Cod Museum of Art. Again, that's in Dennis, Mass. And it's of Hans Hofmann to celebrate the work that he did in Provincetown. And just the one from 1941, a wonderful color crayon image of Provincetown. So not only the early settlers working in the realist style, working en plein air, but Provincetown was also a draw for many of these modern artists. And in fact, in the 40s and 50s, artists like Franz Klein, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, Robert Motherwell, Helen Frankenthaler, Fritz Bultmann, in addition to Hofmann, probably he was the draw for them, but they came to Provincetown. And in fact, Robert Motherwell ended up, he had been married actually to Helen Frankenthaler. He actually settled in Provincetown. He died in Provincetown in 1991, and he's buried there. So I just think it's really interesting that Provincetown, as a continuous art colony, has been a draw for a number of artists. And you'll certainly, when you're there, there's a wonderful museum right in Provincetown, in addition to the Cape Cod Museum of American Art. Right in Provincetown, you can see many of the artists who were painting in this area. So well worth a wonderful visit. As I say, probably avoid the high summer months, but a wonderful visit in the spring and in the fall. Now, Gloucester, Rockport area, the so-called Cape Ann area. Many people have perhaps visited Gloucester. It's just a lovely, lovely community, not far north of Boston, right off of 128 as you're heading up, and a beautiful view. And Gloucester was an incredibly important piece, and in fact, one of the oldest working art colonies in the country. So let's see what's happening in Gloucester. If you're familiar with the artist Fitzhenry Lane, and you note the dates, 1844, 1864, he was an artist, a little bit, probably a generation older than or younger than Thomas Cole, but he was one of the first artists. He was born in Gloucester. He was actually a paraplegic. He could not walk, but he would be seen out in his buggy creating these early works of the area of Gloucester, Brace Rock and Easton Point. So he was really one of the earlier artists, but it wasn't quite a colony then. And you can see here the Cape Ann Museum. I'll point that out in just a moment when we look at Gloucester. It has the largest collection of the works by Fitzhenry Lane right in Gloucester. It's a beautiful museum. They have wonderful exhibitions. I went to one a few years ago on Winslow Homer, but they have wonderful, wonderful exhibitions. And as a bonus, if you go this summer, the Sargent House, also in Gloucester, has an exhibition of Emily Sargent. That's John Singer Sargent's sister. Sargent House in Gloucester is owned by relatives of John Singer Sargent, the American artist, and a cache of her watercolors were found. And so there's currently going on an exhibition. So if you get to Cape Ann, the Cape Ann Museum, you can also head over to the Sargent home to see some wonderful watercolors by the sister of John Singer Sargent, Emily Sargent. Winslow Homer loved Gloucester. Also, you can see he was there in 1873, the incredible rich colors that he created in this oil on canvas. Then in 1880, just before he headed off to England for 18 months, he's creating this gorgeous watercolor, also inspired by his Gloucester experience. So we know that Winslow Homer was up in the White Mountains, but is also heading in. So he was in the White Mountains a little earlier. Now in his about 10 years later, he's in the Gloucester area. And I'm just showing you a couple of works of many of his works from Gloucester. We know again, Willard Metcalf, we had seen him earlier in the Cornish area. He too was painting these works a little bit later in the century, again, 1896, the Gloucester Harbor, the fish wharves. So you see, and Metcalf is an artist who really got around. He really enjoyed traveling to many of these colonies, but you can see the inspiration. It was the light, the color, these beautiful, beautiful areas. And Gloucester was certainly a very important spot for many people. And although certainly there are art galleries there, there's not as much of an art colony as you might find in Provincetown, but wonderful galleries. The museum, the Cape Ann Museum, is great. And you can certainly see that wonderful environment. John Twachtman, an artist whom we'll be seeing particularly in the Connecticut colonies, was also in Gloucester around 1900. These are all in the summer. Again, when they're moving, they're going away. And he was, again, another American impressionist. Working in New York. Some of them were working in Boston, but the majority were working in New York, and they would spend their summers traveling to different areas. And certainly around 1900, Twachtman was in Gloucester. Frank Duveneck, again, another artist working in the early part of the 20th century. These are work, the one on the lower right is you can find in the Cape Ann Museum. So another interpretation, the bright colors, the wonderful light, another artist inspired by Gloucester. Child Hassam, certainly someone you're going to be seeing, particularly when we look at the Connecticut colonies. He's probably one of the most well-known American impressionists. Gloucester was an inspiration for him. Not only the beautiful harbor, but also here at the church in Gloucester. You can see he was there in 1899. He was again there in 1918. So these artists would very often travel many times, many summers, to visit the beautiful lighting in Gloucester. Celia Bow. Now, Celia Bow, I want to include some women artists, but Celia Bow was, in fact, someone who she had visited Gloucester with her family. She's kind of from the Boston area, and she had the opportunity, or actually New York, I'm sorry, she's really from the Philadelphia area, but her family visited Gloucester. And Cecilia Bow is a figure painter. She's a portrait painter, and did very few landscapes. In fact, this is the only landscape that I could find, but it's half tide in the Annisquam River, which is in Gloucester, that she did in 1906. She had visited there with her family in the mid-80s, and she ended up building a house and a studio in 1906, the year this was done. She continued to be one of the most important portrait painters in the country. In fact, she did a portrait of the Prime Minister of France after World War I. She was very, very prominent, but she did very few landscapes, but she settled for every summer she visited until her death in 1942, she visited Gloucester. So it was an inspiration for her. And again, attached to, again, these wanderings, as she noted in her own biography. Edward Hopper, again, 1912. We'll be seeing him in Maine, but he also enjoyed Gloucester. You can see a very different approach. He wasn't as interested in the harbor, but he loved the construction of the homes in Gloucester. So moving into the second half of the 20th century. So many artists inspired by Gloucester, probably just maybe an hour and a half away for so many of us to have a chance to visit also. Stuart Davis, another artist. He was one of the promoters of the Armory Show. Very modern artist, and many of these groups would be inspired by these. So in 1914, he too creates this harbor in Gloucester. And if you're familiar with the work of Stuart Davis, in 1927, 1928, while he was in Gloucester, he created his infamous Egg Beater #1. He created his Egg Beater series. This was actually a gift from Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney to the Whitney Museum of Art. And he was working on this wonderful piece, a very modern piece. He was one of the supporters of the Armory Show, where we became exposed to modern art. So I just wanted to show you all the different artists, very different styles, but inspired by the wonderful light and atmosphere of Gloucester, Massachusetts. And this is the Cape Ann Museum. So I do hope you have a chance to see again the Cape Ann Museum. A wonderful representative of so many of the works. Certainly Fitzhenry Lane. It's the largest collection of his, but also a number of the artists that we've just seen are shown in this wonderful museum in Gloucester. And again, the Sargent House is running an exhibition on Emily Sargent's watercolors. So a bonus for you. Now let's head to Connecticut. We're just going to be quickly going through the last two states, Connecticut and Maine, and you'll see a fairly strong consistency in Connecticut. It really was the home, you might say, of American Impressionists. Cos Cob, and you can see the map here, it's really a section of Greenwich. It's really part of Greenwich, but it is given itself. You can see the Bush Hawley House is right near the coast. Here's the train station. And it was these train stations that allowed artists to head up from New York. It was a very quick, less than an hour train drive in a whole new world. We had already seen Twachtman in his work in certainly in Gloucester, but the old Hawley House, this is where most of the artists would stay. And the Hawley House is open now to the public. So you can actually see the vistas, the images that I'll be sharing with you. Again, just a few of the artists who were there. They were there in some cases in the winter. Twachtman bought property not far from here, not far from Old Lyme, in fact. So we see here the old Hawley House, which is where many of the artists stayed, the Hawley family in Cos Cob. And it was literally an art colony, a chance to get away from New York City in the summer. And Twachtman was one of the artists who began one of the schools in that area. You can see here, he purchased a farm near Old Lyme, which we'll look at in just a moment, in 1888. He painted a variety of scenes. He was considered kind of a tonalist artist. Unfortunately, he died relatively young in 1902. But in looking at these works, he started a school, and he was able to then create a wonderful environment for many artists. Many of the students he had at the Art Student League in New York would simply follow these artists to their summer colony, and Cos Cob was one of them. We see here, this is a beautiful piece in the Florence Griswold Museum. We'll be looking at Old Lyme in just a moment. He established summer classes in 1890. He normally lived and worked in his farm near Old Lyme, but spent the winters of his life in Cos Cob, particularly in 1901, 1902, while his family was in Paris. It was before the end of his life. So some beautiful works, but he was one of the artists who set up a colony, a summer studio with exhibitions in Cos Cob. Child Hassam, you'll be able to see the work. So this is the upper left, Mrs. Hawley of Cos Cob, Connecticut in 1912. Child Hassam also provided summer school for artists. He was teaching at the Art Student League. He then would go to Cos Cob in Connecticut. So it's a beautiful area. This home is still there. And note Child Hassam, this mantelpiece, it's oil on wood. It's a cigar box lid. So it's a very small piece, but it's in the home that you can literally see today. It's owned by the Greenwich Historical Society, but it's a wonderful visit to be able to see where these artists were working. And Elmer McCrae, you can see a little different artist, perhaps a little bit more subtle, a little bit more like Whistler, was painting also. And he married Constance Hawley, the daughter of the proprietor of Cos Cob, where most of the artists would stay. So again, some family connections there, and he too was inspired. We can see the schooner in the ice viewed from the Bush Hawley house, and here again, the mill bridge in Cos Cob. And another artist, one of the artists often associated with the Ashcan School, was also an American Impressionist and spent time also in Connecticut. They were good friends with one another and were very much inspired by these works. Now, Old Lyme is also another wonderful place to visit. And not only can you see the home of Florence Griswold, who, with the death of her father, it was she and her sister, they had to make ends meet. It was the latter part of the 19th century, around 1900, she converted her home into a place for artists. She knew that they were in Cos Cob. She was able to draw them up to this area. And this is probably one of the strongest art colonies in New England from 1900 until about 1935. This area, and you can see that it's not too far from New London, New Haven. Again, it's not and Cos Cob would be down in this area if you're looking at the map. So certainly an opportunity to do both visits. And not only is there the house that you can see at Old Lyme, but they've also created a beautiful museum to be showing a number of the works of art that they have. So they have restored the home, they've maintained that, but they also have a lovely museum with many, many works of art that you can see by these Connecticut artists. This is Willard Metcalf. In fact, the Florence Griswold home has the largest collection of Metcalf's work, and we've seen him in Gloucester. We've seen him in a variety of different locations. It's a beautiful piece. Now, Henry Ward Granger, who was considered a tonalist artist, arrived again around 1900, arrived in Old Lyme, escaping the squalor of New York City and coming up. And so he was considered kind of a Barbizon school artist, a tonalist artist. And so he would create many of these works. You can see many of them in the Florence Griswold Museum. But then Child Hassam also spent a number of summers in Old Lyme. And so it's you might say, here's the tonalists and here are the impressionists. And so here we see Impressionism certainly did win out. And Old Lyme, and you can note here, gift of the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company in 2002, so fairly recently. They collected this company that literally insured steam boilers. I think they're still in existence, and they're the largest company that does this and insures large equipment. They were in Hartford, Connecticut. They were committed to Connecticut, and they bought over their time in the last century about 190 works of art by Connecticut artists. And in 2002, they gave their collection to the Florence Griswold Museum because they had that museum in addition to the home. So it's a great collection. And you can see the one on the right is part of that collection. So we have, again, Metcalf is also there in Old Lyme, creating these wonderful, wonderful pieces. Both of these works are at the Florence Griswold Museum. Another woman artist, Matilda Brown, was one of the few women artists who were working with this art colony. And they would create associations. They stayed at Florence Griswold. Usually the big wigs stayed at Florence Griswold's home. Chalhassam, Metcalf, Brown. The students would stay at local areas, and they literally would bring their classes from the Art Student League in New York to Old Lyme. And Old Lyme had an art association, they had a museum, and they had exhibitions every summer, just until about 1935, that would draw people from across the country. So they were probably the strongest for that 35-year period. They were an incredible group, and what a wonderful opportunity to inspire us, the country, in terms of looking at American Impressionism. But I wanted to give credit to Matilda Brown, one of the few women artists creating these glorious works of still life, certainly inspired by the Impressionists. And if you visit the house, in addition to the museum, these are just some photographs I took several weeks ago. This is an example of the dining room. And in order to sometimes pay for their meals, this is, in fact, if you see the upper left, I think this is a work by Metcalf of Matilda Brown painting in Old Lyme. They would paint doors, panels. That was kind of the payment that they would give to Florence Griswold. And so you can relive these experiences. And it was Matilda Brown who got to paint her bedroom doors, Florence Griswold's bedroom doors. So it's just a fabulous opportunity for you to see the home where these artists live, in addition to a separate museum on the grounds that has many of these works of art. Now, as a bonus, it wasn't necessarily an art colony, but while you're in Connecticut, very close by, Weir Farm, National Historic Site. As I mentioned, in Cornish, New Hampshire, the memorial to Augustus St. Gaudens is a national park. The only other national park in America dedicated to an artist is Weir Farm in Wilton, Connecticut. And Weir was one of the colleagues. He knew Chalhassam. He didn't have to go down to Cos Cob or Old Lyme. It's kind of right in between, because he had his own farm. He knew Twachtman very well, and you can actually see his studio and a small museum. He loved Connecticut, and you can see a replica of his Connecticut studio. Initially, he hated the Impressionists, J. Alden Weir, when he went to France. But then he was converted with many of his friends, Chalhassam, Twachtman, Metcalf, all in this area. And you can have a chance to see his wonderful studio and the wonderful environment around it. We're now going to finish with our exploration of New England colonies with Maine. And as we're looking here, I hope that several of you have been to the Ogunquit Museum of Art. but you might not have realized that Ogunquit just south of Wells, just north of York. This is a beautiful area if you're familiar with Perkins Cove. I've been going to Maine, to Wells, Maine for more than 60 years. It's the place where we vacationed as a child, and my sister now has retired to Wells, Maine. And so this has always been a wonderful place for us to visit, but I had never been aware that it was also too a major art colony. And again, I'm just going to show you a few of the artists whom you'll be familiar with. But Charles Woodbury was in fact the founder of the first summer classes in Ogunquit. They would be working in Boston, they'd be working in New York, and in 1898, you can see his almost modern pieces. He was working in the early part of the 20th century, but he started a school. He'd bring his people there in the summer, just as people would be brought into Connecticut, even in Cornish, Gloucester. So Ogunquit became a very important location, and Charles Woodbury was one of the first artists to have his class. Another artist, Hamilton Esther Field. These might not be names that you're familiar with, but they were very instrumental in looking at the Ogunquit art colony. He arrived in Ogunquit in the summer of 1902. He opened his own summer art school in 1911. I'm showing you some of his exterior scenes because they, in fact, they're at the Ogunquit Museum of Art, both of these works of art, and I'll be showing you that in just a moment. But he was an individual who, like his colleague Woodbury, started a school, but he was also painting figure works, whereas we know that the work of Woodbury were en plein air, out of doors. Even though these are out of doors, you see different styles developing in these colonies, but living in harmony. Edward Hopper, as I'd mentioned, he was in Gloucester. He also visited Ogunquit in 1914 and 1915. He and his wife Jo would explore these areas. So he too was heading up from New York City to enjoy the beautiful Ogunquit area. And if nothing else, if you visit the Ogunquit Museum of American Art, which was originally called, when Henry Strader, a student of Woodbury, founded the museum in 1953, it was originally Museum of Art of Ogunquit. So many of the students of Woodbury and Field are represented in this museum. It's a small museum, but they have great exhibitions during the summer in particular, usually two. But you can go and see this view. The one in the upper right is a view from the gallery looking out to the harbor of Ogunquit. This is the sculpture gallery that you can go to. And so I usually spend half my time in the museum and half my time looking out to the ocean as the waves are crashing on the rock. So well worth a visit, right on Shore Road, just south of the center of Ogunquit. So a wonderful place. And it is open usually May 1st through October 30th or 31st. So it is only open in the late spring to the early fall, but beautiful, beautiful works that you can see of these Ogunquit colonies. And the last place that I want to share with you is Monhegan Island. Now, this is on my bucket list to visit this summer. I was hoping to get there before I did this program, but I haven't been there yet. But you can see it's an island that you can easily get to from, again, the Boothbay Harbor area. And it is definitely another art colony. A variety of artists would travel there. Robert Henry, who was, again, one of the founders of the so-called Ashcan School, the Eight, who were looking at American realism. They exhibited just once in 1908 together. But Robert Henry, who was the teacher of many of the artists, whom I'll be sharing with you in just a moment. But he was very much a New York boy, but in this is one in the upper left. This is one of 25 paintings. Now, they were only 8 by 10 that he painted over 4 days on his first visit in 1903 to Monhegan Island. So it was an incredibly inspirational place, not only for his oils, but also here's a pastel that he created on Monhegan Island. Rockwell Kent, very well known for his stay on Monhegan Island. He actually built a home that Jamie Wyeth then bought. But he settled on Monhegan Island, was painting in the early 20th century, creating very different pieces. He's created a lot of different images of Monhegan Island, a very unique style. Reminds me a little bit of almost Maxwell Parrish with his interesting colors, but he was there year round in the early part of the 20th century. George Bellows, who was a student and a colleague of Robert Henry, was also there during the summer months. Again, beautiful works of Monhegan Island. Edward Hopper, again, when he was down in, he was first in 1914, 1915 in Ogunquit. He headed a little further north, also to Monhegan Island in the summer times. So you can see both pieces from the Portland Museum of Art, which in fact, as an aside, the Portland Museum of Art also owns Winslow Homer's studio just south of Portland. So if you're interested in a tour of that, it's a little pricey. I think it was about $50 when I did it several years ago, but it's a private tour. About 20 people go. They give a private tour. They drive you to the studio. It's very limited because it's a private area, usually in the spring and in the fall, but that's another bonus if you want to see Winslow Homer's studio in the as part of the Portland Museum of Art group. So here, Edward Hopper was there. And I'm finishing with the Wyeths. N.C. Wyeth, Andrew Wyeth, and Jamie Wyeth were all inspired by Monhegan Island. In fact, Jamie Wyeth, the piece that you see here in the lower section of the slide, that house is the house that was built by Rockwell Kent. And then he ended up, Jamie Wyeth ended up buying it. And in fact, Jamie Wyeth is still involved with Monhegan Island. The Monhegan Museum, which is available for you to see. It's great as a day visit, but people recommend staying overnight on the island. There are various hotels. The Wyeth Foundation in 2018 gave $1 million to the Monhegan Museum. And so you can still see, this is Jamie Wyeth. You can still see the importance of this, and another wonderful museum to see. Well, I know this has been a quick overview, but I hope that you've now been thinking about some new places or going back to some places perhaps that you've been to, but that you hadn't realized were such an integral part of the late 19th and early 20th century American creative experience. So I do hope you have a wonderful summer and that you might be able to include a few of these local sites, all about, less than 2 hours away in terms of being able to enhance your enjoyment of your summer travels this year. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions, share observations. Please put into the chat if you are familiar with any hotels or restaurants or anything else you can share in terms of enhancing our summer experiences. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
So folks, let's give Martha a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And let's take roughly 15 minutes of audience questions and comments. So Mary says, we just stopped to visit at the Portland Art Museum on a trip back to Quebec. It was quite a hidden gem.
Excellent.
Kathleen says, a few years ago, we visited the St. Gaudens historical site in Cornish. It was an awesome place to visit.
Great.
Marion notes the exhibition Edward Hopper and Cape Ann is coming to the Cape Ann Museum in July, from July 22nd to October 16th. So for several months. It's in collaboration with the Whitney.
Yes, most of his collection, actually, Edward Hopper's collection, he donated it to the Whitney Museum. And that's great. That's wonderful. So you'll get to see Emily Sargent and Edward Hopper all in Gloucester. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Margaret, Iris, Lois, and Judy all say thank you. Pamela says, thank you for a lovely presentation. I want to visit Connecticut and Monhegan Island. Fortunately, have visited all the others, but also want to revisit.
Great.
Let me jump over to the Q&A. Okay. So Martha, I only gave you an hour, right? So we had to consolidate this 5-week course. But Pamela would like to know, did Rhode Island and Vermont have any art colonies?
Yeah, I could not find anything in Vermont. Not, certainly there are going to be people who would travel to Vermont, but I could not find, like Bristol. You think maybe Bristol, but nothing in the same context as these areas. When I did my research for my longer program, and before I even offered the description for the work that I'm doing with the WISE program, I really kind of scoured, and some would comment on some of the others, but no, I couldn't find anything in Vermont. I couldn't find anything in the Rhode Island area. Not that there weren't people painting in those areas, but not the more formal art colonies, or not the Cornish group that you had so many different artists coming together to that area. Great question. Thank you for asking. But no, I could not find any colonies. I looked, but I could not find any.
Margaret asks, where is the Adams Memorial located, and what is the history behind grief?
Oh, okay. So I want to say it's in New York, but don't hold me to that, because there's a wonderful example in Washington. So Adams, his wife died, and we believe it was likely a suicide. So that grief is a monument that Adams created for his wife. And it is just a phenomenal piece. A woman, again, believed to have committed suicide. And so I want to say it's in New York, but don't hold me to that. I'm sorry, I can't recall. But when you go to St. Gaudens Place, you'll see the background, the history. Because these are things that were cast in various sizes, Augusta St. Gaudens, his wife, was able to find, either get donated to, or was able to recreate many of his works. So if you like St. Gaudens' work, and he was the most important artist, sculptor in the late 19th and early 20th century, certainly by far. Like Rodin eventually, probably with modern art, but Augustus St. Gaudens was so important, and you can see literally all of his works in that one location. So grief was a monument that was commissioned by the husband of the woman who is shown there after her death.
An anonymous attendee asks, was Maxfield Parish's house a museum at some point, or was there a plan at some point to make it a museum?
Right. It was interesting. When I was doing research on Maxfield Parish, he did buy a house. I think he called it the Oaks. So he did live there. He did live there year round, particularly when he started experiencing tuberculosis. But, I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, there was a notice that the house was up for sale, and there was a discussion. It's never been a museum. And they said, wouldn't it be great if somebody came up with some money to make it into a museum? But as far as I know, that's not the case. It's a private home still that he built, I think in the 1880s, in the Cornish area. But no, there is no, and I couldn't find any other museums. It's really the Augustus St. Gaudens Memorial, which is well worth the visit. And you might see then works at the Hood Museum in Dartmouth. They may have, because it's not very far away from Dartmouth College, but there were no other museums that I could find in the Cornish area. So no, his home, although people have proposed that, is still in private hands and was recently being sold.
An anonymous attendee says, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Can Martha please recommend some good books, either fiction or nonfiction, about these fascinating art colonies? You have any book recommendations off the top of your head, Martha?
Well, I have this. I always go to the Worcester Art Museum for my books. It's interesting because I'm trying to think if I have any others locally. So if you, this is Art Colonies of New England, you'd think that, oh, wow, that would be perfect. But in fact, it really focuses more on Maine. I think it gives us a little bit, it might give a little bit on Gloucester. The Connecticut coast, yes. And then and then Maine, Ogunquit and Monhegan. So there's not one that kind of gives you everything, but if you do just look at Art Colonies of New England, you'll find several books. But this is one that I had gotten from the Worcester Art Museum, and it was just chock full of so much good information that I decided to buy it. I love getting my books on abebooks.com. It's often used books. That's a great resource. I would recommend, kind of Art Colonies of New England on abebooks.com, and you can find some really good deals on some beautiful books. So so that was just my recommendation. I don't recall if there are any like nonfiction or any fiction books that kind of talk about some of the experiences. Nothing like Chicago and that wonderful murder mystery at the World's Fair. But sorry, that it's only some nonfiction that I'm aware of. Hopefully that's helpful. Robert might be able to find some books on Art Colonies of New England to loan out.
I'll see what I can do.
Thank you.
Francis asks, did the Hoopers, who had a house in Truro on the Cape, have any ties to the Provincetown art colony?
Edward Hopper.
I think that's what she meant.
Yes, certainly on the Cape. They were very big on the Cape, and Truro was not that far from Provincetown. So yes, I just had an opportunity to visit. If you're interested in Hopper, he was born in Nyack, New York, which is right on the kind of Connecticut, New York border. So yes, he was certainly involved in a number of his, and again, as I say, I couldn't include all of the artists who happened to be there. Edward Hopper, I was particularly looking for, because I think he represents a later period, beyond American Impressionists. He's really a very unique artist. So it'll be great to see that exhibition in Gloucester at the Cape Ann Museum. I'm sure they'll probably include some other things from Massachusetts. So it's great. But also it's important to note, I'm looking forward to doing a program on Hopper, Joe, and Edward Hopper, because Joe is really the woman behind him. They married late, and so she also created some works of art. She was an artist at that period. So yes, I think he probably would have been connected with Provincetown, Gloucester, a lot of those areas. He did really enjoy the Cape, and that exhibition at the Cape Ann Museum will be very interesting to see in July.
An anonymous attendee writes, "We are planning to visit the Florence Griswold Museum this fall. We're also considering the New Britain Museum of American Art, as they appear to have a nice collection of American Impressionist works. Would you recommend that museum?"
Absolutely. In fact, if you can, now it's a little bit different location. So Old Lyme, the Florence Griswold, you could spend an entire day there for the museum as well as the house. What I would also recommend, if you're in that area, so the New Britain Museum of Art is fabulous. It's an American collection. It's the first museum in America devoted to American art. It's a very historic museum. Lots of great works. If you're interested in like Thomas Hart Benton, they bought some of his murals from the WPA project. But just about 10 or 15 minutes away is the Farmington. In Farmington is the oh heavens. Okay. It's the home of Theodore Pope. So there's a home. If you look up in Farmington, Connecticut, where Miss Porter's school is, there is a home of a family who knew Mary Cassatt, who bought Monets, who bought Whistlers. And so I'm so sorry that I'll try to make sure that Robert has the connection with that. But it's a great, Hillstead Farm. So look up Hillstead Farm. It's about 10 or 15 minutes from the New Britain Museum of Art. What I did is I took a friend in the morning to the New Britain Museum of Art, so all this great stuff. We then went to Hillstead Farm for lunch, sitting out overlooking the Connecticut Valley, and then went into a home. It is so fabulous to see how the other half lived, and they collected works of art and they lived with these works of art. It's a little bit like Florence Griswold home, but she was like encouraging students and the teachers. This Hillstead Farm shows you the works of art that were being collected in the late 19th and early 20th century. So those two museums, New Britain Museum of Art and Hillstead Farm, are wonderful, wonderful combination. Old Lyme is a little further away, but even near Old Lyme, there were some interesting museums, the Slater Museum, the Allen Memorial Museum. So in Old Lyme, there were some other museums, and certainly Cos Cob is not too far away from there too. Lots of exciting places in Connecticut.
So Barb recommends the book Call of the Coast, published by Portland Museum of Art by Thomas Denenberg. It's available at several Massachusetts libraries. Call of the Coast. Jean says that, Jean believes that there's a tour in Truro of Hopper's painting sites.
Excellent, excellent.
Francis says another great art museum in Connecticut is the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford.
The
Carol
oldest museum in the United States. The Wadsworth Atheneum is the old, not too far. I don't know that you could do both Wadsworth and the Connecticut, but if you do the Wadsworth, you can also see the Mark Twain home and I think Harriet Beecher Stowe. So they're all in Hartford. So again, that would be a great combination to do the Wadsworth Atheneum, the oldest museum in America, great collection, but great European collection, but also very close to the Mark Twain home and the Harriet Beecher Stowe homes.
Ada says wonderful conversation, very appreciated and very enjoyable. Maria says she recommends visiting the Coastal Maine Botanic Garden near Boothbay Harbor if you go to Maine to Mohegan. Winslow Homer's studio is awesome and well worth the money.
Excellent. It was when I went. It's just beautiful to see. Just beautiful to see. The other thing,
Carol, Martha. So Martha, we're in the speed round right now. Okay. Sure. So Martha's recommends The Narrow Land by Christine Dwyer Hickey, based on the lives of Joe and Edward Hopper, and takes place in Truro on the Cape. She read it and recommends it. So it's called The Narrow Land.
Narrow Land.
Wendy says, great job. What do you mean when you say tonalist artists? Am I saying that correctly? Yeah. What is that?
Totally. So that would have been Twachtman, and also Whistler was a tonalist artist. Unlike Charles Hassam, the so-called Impressionists, where they had dashes and dabs of paint. So you see the strokes of paint. A tonalist artist like Twachtman and Whistler would create a very smooth surface. Thomas Dewing was also a tonalist. You could barely see the strokes. There's a softness. It's a mood. The tonalists, the tonalists were creating a mood. Whistler, Twachtman, and it was very soft, unlike Hassam and Metcalf, who would create dashes and dabs of paint. Thank you so much for allowing me to clarify that. Hopefully that clarifies that. It's a different style of painting, often bright colors, but it's smoother in a tonalist, creating almost more of a mood than the sharpness of the strokes.
All right, we're going to wind down with a couple more questions and comments. Diane says, I read that Winslow Homer entered a painting into the art show at the Topsfield Fair, presumably when he was at the Gloucester Art Colony. Do you happen to know what piece he entered into that show?
I do not know that.
That's okay.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Probably fairly early on in his career, before he went to England. Good point. Thank you.
Joan says, wonderful presentation, very easy to understand. The grief is at St. Gaudens Garden.
It is, yes.
Frank says, bravo. Yeah. Frank says, bravo, great presentation, Martha. We have visited several of these art colonies, and they are well worth visiting. Kathleen says, wonderful overview, great inspiration for seeing more art on our upcoming New England trip. Pamela says, grief is also in Rock Creek Cemetery in DC.
That's where it's located. Yeah, that's where it's actually, that's where the monument is in DC. Thank you.
Gotcha. Joan says there was a private museum for Parrish owned by a woman who was a huge fan. It is now gone, but I have seen some of his works in Vermont on the other side of the river. We accessed it via a covered bridge.
Oh, excellent.
And Cheryl says, great presentation. and asking for some of the book titles that I've mentioned. So I'll see what I can do there, Cheryl. We had a few more questions in the Q&A, but Martha, we're all out of time.
Oh,
So folks, look for an email from me tomorrow, link to a feedback survey, link to a recording, information about some other upcoming virtual art history programs. We have a few more here in June. But once we get to July and August, we're transitioning from Thursday mornings to Friday mornings. I anticipate that being temporary. Martha, any last words before we shut it down?
no, I just want to thank you, Peter, as Robert, as always, for allowing me to share this information. And again, everyone have a wonderful summer. I'll look forward to seeing you in July and August. But again, stay happy and healthy and enjoy the wonderful, wonderful experiences we have here in New England. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Robert, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. We'll see you next month. Have a good night.
Take care. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye.